Today I'm speaking with Ashley Flieger. Ashley, thank you so much for joining me today.
Hi, thanks. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I appreciate you doing this. And I just want to give a very brief bio because it's going to be brief because I don't know too much about you yet, but I know that you're doing some great work. Ashley is a fellow YouTuber under the name or handle Apostate Ashley. And do you have any other platforms besides YouTube you're doing right now?
I'm mostly on YouTube, but I do have TikTok, Instagram, Facebook. That's about
Gotcha.
it. And I do operate the Clergy Project Twitter as well at Project Clergy.
Gotcha. I definitely want to talk more about that later, but that's awesome too. It's great stuff that they're doing. And you also have multiple sclerosis. How long have you dealt with that issue? I know we'll talk more about that later, but how long has that been a part of your life?
I got diagnosed May 4th of 2016.
Okay, gotcha. We'll
So I'm
definitely
going
dive more into that.
on, well, I just passed 6 years. Yeah.
How, just in a big picture sense, how are you doing with all that so far?
Right now, I'm actually doing really, really good. I've been in remission for about 3 years. I've been on a new type of chemotherapy medication called Ocrevus, and I am so thankful. I feel so much closer to normal.
Hmm,
I do struggle on the daily with some permanent symptoms that have unfortunately not healed, but as a whole, I'm walking. I don't have walking devices that I'm using or anything. I feel really good. Thanks to
that's awesome.
science.
That's awesome. Yeah. And where are you located?
I am in Ohio.
Okay, nice. Very nice. We're both in the Eastern time zone. Have you always been in Ohio?
Well, except for while I was in the ministry, I went out to Iowa, Des
Okay,
Moines, Iowa for a while. But yes, I grew up near Toledo, Ohio, and then came back
nice,
to
nice.
Ohio.
I've been there a little bit. When I was a teenager, we went to a Baptist camp called OPEN. It was like a mixture of churches in Ohio and Pennsylvania. So they mixed it and called it OPEN.
Oh,
But OPEN Baptist camp, I was there. But it's a very flat state, isn't it?
yeah,
Yeah, I remember that.
yeah.
Well, before we get into the interview, is there anything else you can tell us just about yourself in terms of hobbies or fun things about you, or even things you're aspiring to do, like your list of to-dos for adventures or vacations?
Well, I am pretty boring for the most part, unfortunately,
I don't
but
believe that.
right now I'm a stay-at-home mom,
Okay.
so I do a lot of housework, stuff like that. I do a lot of trying to create my YouTube videos now. I spend a lot of time doing that and editing and you know, um I have two 12-year-olds. I have my daughter and I have a stepson, and we like to go out and do basic things like go to the park, go to nature preserves and walk around, take hikes, and throw the football around, throw the frisbee around, go on bike rides, things
That's
like
fun.
that. And nature has been something that I've really, really loved in the last few years. And so I've been spending a lot more time getting out and admiring the trees and all the flowers and birds, all that kind of stuff.
Hmm,
And so that's been kind of a big thing. I got into crocheting for a while
nice.
and um I don't I don't know. I really do just a lot of things at home because for quite a while I was always required to be out and at the church as a pastor. So I love being home. I love being home now, and I don't know, even taking care of house plants, things like that.
Yeah,
So
nice. I was curious, just in terms of more fun questions. Two quick hits. What is your favorite drink to order at Starbucks, and what's your dream vacation
my favorite drink at Starbucks.
or any
I
coffee
think
shop?
traditionally at Starbucks I've always gotten like an iced caramel macchiato.
Nice.
Um or even just like the iced cold brew.
Hmm. That
I
sounds
like
good.
Yeah, I like that with just some cream and sugar.
What's your dream vacation?
Dream vacation. Oh, like one of those like hut things on the water in Bora Bora.
Nice. Those are so cool when you see those pictures. I always,
Yeah.
I often wonder that like they seem like there are always like a dozen or so of them, and I wonder how easy it is to hear each other, or if it feels private, but it does look
Yeah,
beautiful.
I didn't think about that. Yeah.
Yeah,
It
cool.
would
Well,
be cool to just jump off the deck though, like out your front door, jump into the water.
yeah, especially if it's really free of any sharks or whatever, whatever
Hmm.
could come get you. Well, I appreciate your doing the fun bio there, but I'd love to pass the ball to you to kind of take us into your story. Take us back as early as you can. Remember, all of your journey, especially anything that relates to what formed your worldview about God.
Okay. Well, m- my story, I suppose, is a little bit different from others who were brought up and reared in religion by their parents. I sort of was, but not really. My mom took me for a short 3 years between the time I was 5 and 8 years old. We went to an Assemblies of God church. And, Assemblies of God churches are, they're charismatic. There's a lot of the speaking in tongues, and that is hard to explain what speaking in tongues is, altar calls and, raising of your hands during worship. But it was a lot of feeling like you have direct communication with God and
Mm.
you're raising your hands in surrender to him during worship, during worship music going. There's a whole atmosphere where the lights are down, and they kind of set the mood in the room, and you're very free to express your emotions, cry or laugh or anything in those instances, in those services. And so we went there for a little while. There was a church split, and we stopped going when I was 8. And I got invited to go back when I was 12 years old by some kids at high school to
Can I
the
ask
very
about
same church.
with your parents? Were they Christians?
My mom has basically always remained a believer since then. She tried getting back into church after that church split, but she could never find a church that was quite the same
Okay.
as it was at that one Assemblies of God church
And in terms of just
before.
how she responded or raised you, were you raised from a young age to believe in Jesus, or was that not as big a deal? Was that more the church's responsibility?
It was kind of more the church's responsibility because I kind of grabbed on. I was the only one in my family after that church split that kind of grabbed on to church again and was attending on a regular basis. And so it was more the church. My mom was very encouraging of it because she very much did believe in Jesus and she still does. And so yeah, she would come with me sometimes, but most of the time I went all by myself. Life at home was kind of hard for a while. My parents were their marriage, they were struggling, and things were hard with my dad at home. It was things were kind of rough. He was an alcoholic and I don't know, dabbling into some pills, things like that. So it was things were they felt very like um tense at home, and I wanted to find an escape. I wanted to get out. And I remember feeling that way from very young age, really. And so church kind of became my escape. So I did have my mom to lean on in a way because she was very like-minded to me, but didn't come alongside me. Nobody really came alongside me to church after that 8-year-old Ashley, And so I really really leaned on a lot of the women and peers at my church
Hmm.
when I would go there.
What was the earliest time that you ever heard someone invite you to believe in Jesus as your savior?
5 years old.
through your mom
That
or
was
through
fun.
church or both?
Both. My
Yeah.
mom was there, and I believe it was an altar call, meaning,
Mhm.
usually at the very end of a church service. I believe that my mom was in the church service, and it was actually a Wednesday night, maybe, when youth group and kids church is going on, and then she was in the sanctuary for the adult service. And so kids church was let out, and I walked into the sanctuary to go find my mom, and she was up at the very front at the altar, just in front of the stage. And music was down low. They had done communion that night as like a special thing, and I remember my mom. I it's like this vivid memory. My mom was holding the wafer and her cup of juice, and she had a little bit of the juice on the wafer, and it was like a little soggy, and I remember like focusing on that, like, how is she holding that for so long and it's so soggy. But she was crying and weeping and genuinely thankful for Jesus dying on the cross. And I remember feeling so impressed by my mom,
Mm.
and the fact that she was in that moment. At least this is like me trying to describe how I felt as a 5-year-old, but I remember I was right there on the right side of my mom, just like looking at her, and she was crying. I'm like, "Mom, why are you crying?" And she's like, "Because Jesus loves us so much and he died on the cross." And I thought, wow, my mom is like really getting what this situation is. Like she's really, and I knew that the wafer and the juice were what they symbolized, the body and the blood. And I remember understanding that at that age too,
Mm.
because they very much talked about that in the church. And then I remember she eventually drank the juice and ate the wafer, and she asked me if I wanted to accept Jesus into my heart. And so we said the sinner's prayer right there. And I believe she called over the pastor as well. And
Mm.
so I was sitting up there at the altar with her. And so it was kind of like a happy, like loving memory. She was there with me and like proud of me that I was accepting Jesus into my heart.
Every parent's dream come true.
Yeah.
What happened next in the story?
Well, we were very, very close with a lot of the people there in the church, and we went very regularly. My mom became a youth leader at the church, and we became very close with a lot of the youth. So when I was, around 5 to 8 years old or so, a lot of the kids in the youth group were around the 8, 9, 10 years older than me. And so I looked up to a lot of them. And, my mom was kind of like young and cool, kind of like how I am now. So it'd be like me now going to a youth group as a youth leader and hanging out with some of these youth. And some of them didn't come from maybe Christian homes either. So some of them would come to our house for sleepovers and things like that. And so we were at the church all of the time, even though my mom just attended.
Mm.
And she loved it. So during those years, we were there all of the time, and we became very close with all of these people. My dad didn't really attend with us. He wasn't very interested. Even though he did grow up in church, his mom is still, my grandma goes to an Assemblies of God church up in Michigan, and that's how he grew up. So very much the same way.
Do you know if he's
And
ever like has he made it publicly clear if he's truly a believer or not? Or is that
no,
in
not
question?
really.
Okay.
I don't, I mean, he's very biblically illiterate,
Okay.
and so he really only believes because this is just my perception. His wife is a huge believer, and his mom is a huge believer, and his ex-wife, aka my mom, was a huge believer. So he was kind of surrounded by it, but I definitely don't think he knows what he believes, and he's a major cherry picker too.
Hmm. That's interesting. It must have been so weird to have your parents be kind of on the fence, at least in part, growing up, where like your church is obviously on fire for the Lord, and to have parents that aren't, your dad not necessarily as on fire. And did it feel like you were at any point focusing on like Dad, you need to get close to the Lord, you need to, the Lord is where what life's all about? Did you ever, as you were growing up, find yourself thinking about ways to pull him back into getting close to the Lord?
Oh yeah. My whole family from a very young age, when especially around that 12 years old, when I started going by myself and going to youth group, I would find rides to church so I could get there for any service that was available. And I felt like I was the anchor of my family. I felt like
Hmm.
I was the hope for them to find Jesus, to find their purpose in life. And so I was like, I'm the anchor. I'm going to pray for them. I'm going to go and I'm going to keep going and keep praying until they accept Jesus into their heart and we all go as a family.
I have to ask, just as you obviously this is jumping ahead, but as you look back on that now, does it feel like there's some sense of grieving that you have to do, that you were under so much pressure at an age where you should have been just thinking about, what's the next fun thing to do, and what's the next fun movie to watch, and instead you had that much weighty, the weight of the world, the weight of eternity on your shoulders at a young age? That's a lot for a kid. Do you
Yeah,
feel
I
like
was
you've had to grieve
scared
some of
that I
that?
was going to go to heaven and they were going to go to hell. And
Hmm.
that was very much on my mind for all of those years. And I mean, so much so that I would cry and weep, and I spent a lot of time just praying and hoping that they would join me in this. And I did have a lot of normal memories. I had friends from school. I was into like normal music and doing some normal things too. Um I had my separate church friends and all my separate church people, but I also had all my secular friends and my secular family and everything. But yeah, I feel like I wasted a lot of time thinking and praying. And I don't know, I just spent way too much time worrying about all of that.
Can I ask it on a related note? Did you ever feel like you were responsible personally for saving them, in the sense that, like, just making an example here, where maybe if you had a Saturday night that was free, you didn't have anywhere to be, and you could have spent it on your knees in prayer for your parents, or you could have spent it praying with other friends for your parents, we could have spent it talking and witnessing to your parents, or whatever version of that you could come up with. But instead, you just watched a fun movie. You just got some popcorn and pizza or whatever and had a fun night. And you could have spent it instead begging God to save them. I know a lot of people have talked about how they felt like they were directly responsible, and there's a verse that talks about their blood is on your hands. Did you ever feel like you were responsible, or did you feel like that was a separate category? It's like, I've given you the message, but and I'll give it to you again, but you're now responsible. You have to make your own choice, and if you choose not to, it's not my fault. How did you feel about all that?
I definitely didn't feel the way that you described, where I give them the information and everything's good. It's now their choice. I felt the need to drill it into them. I remember
Mhm.
coming home. I'd be fired up after a Sunday morning, and I'd come home. I remember specifically this one time. My mom was really annoyed, but I did this kind of stuff all the time. She was on the phone talking to somebody, and I came home. I was dropped off, and I was so excited to tell my mom, "Hey, you need to be hot or cold. Choose one. You need to choose one. You can't be lukewarm." And so I was kind of bothering her. I was like, Mom, hey, just for a second, I have something I have to tell you. So can you pause your conversation?" And she's like, "What is it, Ashley?" And so I said, you need to stop being lukewarm. You have to be hot or cold for Jesus. And she's like, would you stop bothering me with this, Ashley? I'm on the phone. I'm like, this is so important, Mom. You have to get off the phone and talk to me.
Yeah, no more
So
living in
yes,
Laodicea.
it was, I very much, I mean, that's kind of like being, I guess, silly laughing about it, but it felt very urgent to me back then, especially
Yeah.
after I would come home from those services. I was so fired up and I was so keyed up.
Speaking of
And
fire, did you believe that the hell was a real place of fire?
yes,
Hmm.
I did.
So you were very driven to make a difference.
Yeah, I did feel the weight of the world. I very much took the Great Commission seriously, that we were supposed to go to the ends of the earth, tell people about Jesus, and tell everybody on earth knew about him.
On that note, did you consider being a full-time missionary at any point?
I was for a while. So
Gotcha.
I
So
was a
I'm
part
jumping
of,
ahead. Go ahead.
yeah. I won't go into too much depth, but yeah. So before I kind of became a pastor, I was a part of a group called Master's Commission, which was, I mean, Master's Commission. It's about the Great Commission. So it's going out and telling people about Jesus. And it was basically like missionaries at large. We would travel all over the country and we would go out of the country at the end of the year, every year, doing missions.
Hmm.
I did
Did you
that
ever
for
have anyone pray with you to accept Christ?
where I led them through the sinner's prayer.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I led a lot of people through the sinner's prayer. A lot.
Gotcha. Can I ask, and this is not to put you on the spot, but do you feel guilty about that? Because I know I did the same and I do feel very guilty about it.
Yeah. I think that's kind of why I'm open about my atheism sometimes, is because I was in kind of a leadership position and a lot of people really took seriously what I said. And so I do feel like I need to shout it from the rooftops sometimes. Hey, I was wrong. Hey, people that took me seriously, I was wrong.
Yeah. Ditto.
And
Very well
I've
said.
gone to quite a few people and I've apologized. Anybody that I have had contact with from those days, I've apologized to them
Yeah.
for
Likewise.
specific memories, like praying for things when they should have gone to the doctor.
Hmm. Is the Assemblies of God Church, I assume, then more into miracles or what do they call it? Name it and claim it theology. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I started off in Assemblies of God. I eventually ended up in open Bible churches, which is extremely similar,
Okay.
but it's very much smaller.
I've never heard
It's
about them. That's interesting. I usually have heard of most denominations. What do you remember any distinctives
They
comparing
derived
them?
out of Foursquare back in,
Okay.
I think, the 60s or 70s. And you've heard of Foursquare, right?
Yeah.
So they derived out of Foursquare, and they're basically identical to Foursquare and Assemblies of God in a lot of ways. Just a
Gotcha.
very, very small denomination.
Interesting. Did you ever see miracles as a kid growing up? Like when they would do these prayers, like what stood out to you growing up as supernatural that was actually supposedly happening there in front of you?
I think I was thinking miracles were happening, but I don't remember any actual miracles happening.
Okay.
It was almost more like adrenaline rushes
Hmm.
is during those services. Like for instance, my mom, one of the reasons why she holds on, aside from the fact that she's afraid of hell, one of the things that she holds on to is this personal experience that she has of going up to the front of the church and getting prayer after a car accident that we were in when I was in second grade. And our van flipped, and in the middle of an intersection, it was right by that church. And coincidentally, the senior pastor of that church was at the intersection in his car, and a couple of the other members of the church. So they were literally there to see the ambulance take us and help us get out of the van and things like that, and pray with us like that on the side of the road. So my mom got a dislocated shoulder and she couldn't move it. So sometime after that accident, she went to a church service and she got prayed for. And then the pastor went up to her and said, "Hey, Carrie, how's your arm doing? Or how's your shoulder doing?" And she's like, "You know what? As a matter of fact, I can move it all around." And so she always talks about that time. And it's just, I don't know. To me, it just seems so silly looking back on it now. But
So that God
um
helped her shoulder heal faster than it would have otherwise.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, interesting.
And so I look back on that and I think of instances like that and I'm like, there's there's got to be a realistic or logical explanation for that, you know? And
Mm.
sometimes I think, adrenaline rushes can do quite a bit, and you get adrenaline rushes in those services. It's all about getting that high, getting that experience.
Mm.
And so you could very easily feel that adrenaline rush and that energy and passion. And then, like a day later, maybe start feeling that pain in your shoulder again. I don't know.
Yeah.
But that's kind of how I think of those experiences. Don't I don't think that anybody ever experienced any actual miracles.
Do you think you ever, at the time, did you ever think you were hearing God's voice audibly?
Not audibly. It was almost like my own thoughts in my head. I could just
He was speaking
It
to
was
you?
just my own feelings, like my own feelings, my own wants.
Hmm. But
But I never heard another voice. It was me. It was my voice.
was there ever a time where it was like so profoundly, I don't know, impactful that you just kind of said, you know what, God definitely just gave me an answer? Maybe if you were, asking him about his will, God, should I date this guy or that guy? Should I go to this college, that college, whatever it was, where it was truly like, I don't know what the answer is. And God just opened up the doors one way or the other. Did you ever feel his will that clearly?
Um, I don't know if it comes to, like, I guess, opening doors. I do remember, I do have this one memory from when I was like 13 where I really thought it was God that answered my prayers. My mom was dating this guy that I didn't want her to date. He wasn't a good guy. And she was supposed to get on a plane out to go visit him out in California. And I prayed and prayed and prayed and prayed that for some reason that flight would be canceled. And it ended up being canceled because of, I don't even know if it was because of weather or whatever it was, but it wasn't delayed or anything. It was straight up canceled. And my
Praise the Lord.
mom came in. Yeah. My mom came in and she's like, "You prayed, didn't you? My flight got canceled." And
Yeah,
I was just floored. I was like, "Oh my God, he did it." He did it. My mom's home. She's not going.
that's awesome.
But that's kind of the closest thing to it. I mean, I think I would have attributed any situations back then to God opening a door, such as, going into master's commission or, getting into, doing Bible college courses and things like that. But really those things happen because I wanted them to happen.
Hmm. Gotcha.
But
Interesting.
back then I very much believed that God was responsible for all of these things happening,
Hmm.
because to me he was like a friend. It was like I talked to him and prayed to him about everything. So it was like he would hear me,
Yeah.
but it was me.
Just a very generic sense, not looking at any specifics here, but just overall between the ages of, 8 and college, did you sense the just the joy of the Lord? Did you feel like you were, at times maybe struggling with, some kind of sin or being down or frustrated or something, and just sensing the Lord kind of rush in, as it were, and give you just the peace and joy? Did you sense his presence, that he was truly making a tangible difference in your heart and your outlook?
Yeah. Um, so I've basically always struggled with like depression and anxiety
Hmm.
pretty bad. From as far back as I can remember. And so when I would go to church, especially in my youth, when I was going to youth groups, and I loved worship. I loved going in there, and they would have the lights down low, and I found, I had friends that would pray with me. They would hug me and or put their hands on my shoulder and pray for me, and it felt like such a nice support. And so I felt like I needed that in quite a few different ways. So there was that, and then also just the atmosphere in the worship, the the fact that I was surrendering myself to God, and the worship music that was playing, it felt like he was giving back. Like it felt very therapeutic to, I don't know, it was like a coping mechanism for me in a way. It felt like I felt God, but
Hmm.
I was having an experience with music and my own personal emotions. And so in those services, I would fully let out my emotions. I would cry, and I would sometimes, laugh hysterically, other people would. And we thought it was the Holy Spirit, and we thought it was God that was doing that for us. We would, get all giddy, and there's a lot of things that can happen, group mentality, and because of music, things like that, or somebody, a leader of some kind up there and kind of priming the atmosphere. And so um the music was very, I still even to this day feel very, I feel everything very strongly, and I feel very strongly connected to music now. And it's none of it is about God, but back then it was. And so because I was struggling so much emotionally, I was struggling at home, and it was kind of my safe haven at the time to get away. And the worship and the prayer was kind of a coping mechanism, because naturally my emotions have always kind of been up and down. So sometimes it felt like, going to these church services on Sundays and Wednesdays at the very least, I would seek those highs, and it kind of helped. And then, I would have those lows in between, and then seek the next high for the next service. It sometimes it matched up well with the emotions I was feeling mentally. Sometimes it made it harder. It was intense. In those lows, I was unmedicated. I wasn't taking medication for quite a while. I did try for a little while, but a lot of those years I was not on medication. And so in some ways it was a coping mechanism, and in other ways it was kind of detrimental for me.
Would
And
your
so,
would you have seen medicine as a demonstration of a lack of faith in God at that time?
yeah, I really thought that God could have healed me.
Hmm.
So and I didn't really consider myself to have any mental illness issues. I would have
Right.
attributed it to sin.
Yeah. And either way, the solution is always God and the Bible and the gospel.
Yeah,
Even if there were a real problem, I know so many groups would do that. It's like, you don't need to go to secular counseling. What you need is more gospel.
yeah,
Your issue is somehow related to, you did not apply, like you don't understand the depths of your sin, you haven't confessed it and admitted it to God, or you haven't, fully received his free grace through the cross in some way. And your lack of understanding and applying that is the only real issue. And once you fix that, I remember, it's a quick anecdote. I had severe insomnia for about 30 years. And
30 years.
yeah, I mean, it was really bad. When I was first, when you're a kid and the math class where you learn to take a fraction into a decimal, like 3/4 equals 0.75.
Hmm.
The minute that I learned that, how to do that as a kid, my mind grabbed it and wouldn't let go. was like a mental OCD. And I don't see other OCD things in my life, but it was about the fractions got me. I mean, they really got me, and I loved it. It wasn't like it was all bad. I saw patterns, and I loved finding new patterns. But math, I literally couldn't sleep because I'd stay awake and just do math facts all night. And for about a year, the math continued. After about a year, the math died down. But when it was over, I still couldn't sleep. And for 30 years, I had that problem. And I moved to
That's
jump forward.
wild. You're just thinking about math?
For the first year, yeah. There's just, I literally cried myself to sleep for that first year.
Wow, that's
just
crazy.
And it got worse and worse and worse, even after the math facts stopped. It got worse and worse and worse for 30 years. And during that time, one of my pastors kind of implied, didn't say it as directly as if you're a sinner for having that problem, but he said, you know, your body keeps score, and God designed it that way. And the reason you can't sleep is there's some kind of hidden sin in you. And for a long time, I was so convicted that like, what am I doing? And of course, when you hit puberty, you know, you're like, oh, I am thinking some sexual thoughts. You're like, that must be the issue, that this is, you know, why this is continuing, or whatever it was. And when I became an adult, I got connected. I was from Philadelphia, but I got connected with some friends down here in Georgia, where I'm at now. And they told me about this really special doctor. Like, this guy cures stuff that no one else cures. It's crazy. And I was like, well, I'll give him a call, but I doubt he can do it. I've seen the best. I've seen the specialists. And sure enough, he cured my insomnia in 1 month with no medicine. It was insane. It was all about neurological stuff, the left brain, right brain things. And when it was over, I thought, for the better part of 30 years, I thought I couldn't sleep because I was a sinner. And it was all left brain, right brain stuff. It's like, this wasn't about sin. This was just about neurology.
The way your body's wired.
Yeah. I was going to add one more thought to your earlier comment about laughing in church. I wasn't into the whole, like, I know was it the Toronto blessing or something, where they just would like laugh and laugh and laugh and laugh, you know, like as if that was the spirit. But I do remember at times in my church worship services having that impact, or that experience of thinking, I'm like, the spirit's just flooding in, like, he's as if he's rewiring this sinful part of my worldview and making it holy. And I remember at times laughing, and it was for this reason. And I wanted to ask if you relate to this. Whenever you sense that life is going poorly, like, this isn't bad, this isn't good, this situation sucks, I feel depressed, I feel angst. And I would sense the spirit saying, God is at work in this. He is the master magician. He's the master architect. He's the master poet. He's the master painter. He's designing your world. He's designing exactly where Ashley needs to be, and exactly where Tim needs to be. And if you could see the world like he does, you wouldn't be upset about anything. You'd be laughing with joy, and you'd be laughing with delight at what he's doing. And I remember at times laughing and saying, God, what am I doing worrying about what you're going to do in my life in a month or in a year and 2 years? Like, why would I do anything except just dance in your presence? And I do remember distinctly laughing several times, thinking, I'm an idiot. I'm an idiot for not trusting God. And just like, laugh. Jesus is in control. He loves you, and he's got you. He's got you in his hands. He always has. Even when it feels like you're not close or things aren't going right, he's got you right where he wants you. Dance in his presence, like I think as King David did. And anyway, I remember that. Would you relate to that kind of laughter, or was it a different kind of laughter for you?
It was a different kind of laughter. I relate to that feeling, though. It was more of like a high, almost. Like uncontrollable laughing. Like everybody else was laughing, and so I would join in. And
that's really interesting.
Yeah, I don't know. There were some very interesting moments, that's for sure.
Let me ask,
and it's embarrassing to admit that I was a part of it. What? Yeah. Oh yeah. I drank it. I drank a few cups.
What makes me think that they laced it with something.
Yeah, I know. I very regularly had this feeling during worship, or during like those moments where I felt like the spirit was moving, and we would have like outbreaks of laughter or crying or being slain in the spirit, where you feel like the Holy Spirit is overwhelming, and you fall in the spirit, like you're so overwhelmed, like your knees buckle type of thing. And I don't know what that feeling actually was, but most of the time it was just, I think, group mentality and the music. But I would feel this like warm feeling over me. I thought it was like anointing oil.
Yeah. I'm sure
And
you'd
but
call it. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I don't go, that's fine. I was gonna say, but in regards to what you were saying about laughing because he has it under control, I did hold on to that a lot too. I would remember things like I would tell myself a lot, remind myself of the scripture where he does things in due time. Um, and I would remind myself that Abraham waited for and prayed for a son for 29 years. And so if he can wait and pray, I can wait and pray too, because his timing is better than my timing,
Mm.
because I'm just a human that can't fathom the thoughts of God.
Yeah, exactly. I know you'd call it manipulative at this point, what they do in worship services, but did you ever at that time question whether it was manipulative? Like, especially when I think you mentioned the fog machine, is that right?
Yeah, there's, yeah, dry ice, fog, whatever they
I
had
didn't,
back
I didn't have that. That's definitely a difference.
then. The
Um,
colored lights, yeah,
I mean,
everything. It
did
was like
you
a rock
ever?
concert.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Did you ever at that time though question whether or not that was creating an atmosphere that wasn't real, or did it
No.
just feel like part of the what a church does to get people ready to worship God?
Yeah, I never thought about the fact like, oh, I feel this way because of all this stuff here. I thought it was just in addition to the Holy Spirit.
Yeah.
I
Hmm.
never questioned it. I mean, I was young. I didn't ever, I mean, I had this mentality of everybody else believes this and it's real for them, so I had no reason to believe it was fake. There was
Yeah.
nobody around me that was saying this wasn't real either.
Yeah.
So yeah, it
Hmm.
was just kind of like a follower type thing,
Yeah. I do want to
I
ask too,
guess.
I want to get back on track with your story a second, but I wanted to ask one question just for the context. You mentioned that you were a associate pastor at some point, which I guess we'll get into shortly, but that's a difference for me, from my background. It was only male leadership, very patriarchal, obviously. Is it
Yeah.
a given that most Assemblies of God churches would allow for a female pastor, or is that just
Yeah.
unique to your church, or
I was in open Bible.
Open
It was
Bible?
through
Okay,
open Bible churches. But yes, in those denominations, they allow female pastors. And
okay,
so
including as
there
the senior
are,
pastor.
yeah,
Okay.
yes. I did know some female senior pastors.
Hmm.
I did know a couple even within our denomination where the wife was the main pastor and the husband was kind of just there along as support.
Hmm.
But at the same time, within a denomination, your church will pay dues into the denomination anyway. So you have a quote unquote covering over you anyway. So when you go up the ranks in, you know, regional and then national leadership there within the denomination, there's still men ahead of you.
Right. Interesting.
So for me, in my instance, though, I was a female assistant pastor with my ex-husband, who was also an assistant pastor, and then we had a senior pastor who was a male.
Gotcha.
So I very much had my ex-husband and then that senior pastor over me, and church board, who
Gotcha.
were
I,
mostly males.
I was curious about that context because that's definitely very different. And I have to ask, when you at some point realized that other churches don't allow that, did that feel like, what's wrong with you? Why won't you let women speak? Be leaders, or like, how did you mentally respond at that time when you first found out that there were churches that would have never permitted such a thing?
I thought that they misunderstood the theology. I thought that, you know, people bring up Second Timothy, and about how women can't speak in the church and they need to, submit to the men and they need to be quiet in the church. And so I interpreted that scripture as that church was chaotic, that the men and the women weren't getting along, and that the women were being chaotic. This is what I was told. And I would kind of hold on to that, which is ridiculous, that I just assumed that this was true. But basically, that the men and the women, and in that culture, they would sit on opposite sides of the church, and that when the men would try to speak, the women were speaking over the men. So Paul was just trying to come in and kind of calm things down and be a peacemaker and say, hey, this can't be so chaotic. You guys need to calm down and let everybody speak. And that, Paul would even have women alongside. There was Priscilla and Aquila, or, and the fact that they mentioned the woman first. And so I would grab onto things like that. Like,
Yeah.
no, you guys are misunderstanding this. Women can be leadership. And so that is how I interpreted it back then.
Gotcha. It's definitely such a different world, and I know this is not the big part of our interview today, but that's such a big difference. And I don't know how I would have felt if I'd grown up in a different kind of church, but it was just like, it wasn't even like people talked about it much. It was just like an assumption, like everyone just kind of knows it's only men that lead the church. And it's kind of weird when you realize that there's obviously other churches, even churches that people felt, whether they're Christian now or not, they felt like they were decent churches where people were healthy. But I do remember a couple times seeing like an Episcopalian preacher, female preacher, which, they tend to wear more of the official, like, Anglican kind of garb, where the fancy robes and stuff. And I remember as a Christian growing up thinking that's such a liberal and apostate and feminist, in a negative sense at the time, perspective. Like you might as well just have the devil preach for you, like, what in the world are y'all doing? You're twisting scripture so bad. And it was just such a given. And I think most everybody in the churches I grew up in would have said, yeah, absolutely. You're just at that point giving the finger to God if you have a female pastor. And it's interesting to hear such a different perspective. But anyway,
I definitely have heard that a lot from people. I mean, now that I'm kind of out and saying things like I'm an ex-pastor, I get a lot of comments everywhere, pointing out that I shouldn't have ever been a female pastor. And so I did start hearing that while I was in the church, and felt I needed to defend that. But even all these years later, I still feel I need to defend that. Men love to point out that I should have never been in that position.
It's so interesting. Well, I know I've kept you from moving on the next stage. So what, you mentioned the missions work you were doing. What happened next after all the missions work you were involved in?
Well, actually, I mean, the Master's Commission was a big part of my life for a while. I kind of consider both of those experiences, like the Master's Commission and then becoming assistant pastor, kind of like one and the same, because we were based out of the church. And so that's how we kind of phased into becoming assistant pastors. So I attended as a student the Master's Commission, which, you take college courses, memorize Bible verses, travel the country, and, put on church services and evangelize basically all across the country, go on missions trip at the end of the year. And so it was basically preparing for church services and evangelizing all across the country all year, taking a break in the summer. But I started off as a student doing that, and I would come back every year. I did that for about 5 years, and I moved into becoming an intern, got a part-time job and interned with them, and then eventually married the assistant director, and then we became directors of the program. And so we led the program and that was a lot of the missions and teaching the Bible college courses and things like that. And then that program kind of fizzled out. I can't think of what year that was, but I was involved in that. I started around the time I was like 18, 19 years old. And then I was involved for about 5 years. And then that kind of fizzled out and we moved into becoming assistant pastors of the church for about 4 years.
Can I
So
ask
my
you a little bit
whole,
about, I'm sorry,
yeah.
I was just curious about how you all met and what your courtship or dating life was like.
Oh, it was very weird and awkward looking back on it.
Really?
Yeah.
Huh.
I don't, so, okay. So we were in master's commission together and he was assistant director of the program the whole time I was in it. Well, I was a student and then an intern. And so when you go into master's commission, the very first year, you're not allowed to date. You're not allowed to have phone conversations with the opposite sex for more than 5 minutes a day. You
Hmm.
can't exchange more than one text message a day with the opposite sex. And then if you decide to come back for a second year or third year and you do want to date, you're you are involving quite a few other people in your decision to date somebody. And so when he and I almost said his name, when he and I decided that we were maybe thinking about dating, we kind of weren't really sure how we felt about dating or not, but we did feel the pressure because we were starting to flirt with each other and they basically were like, shit or get off the pot basically, and brought us together for a meeting and um asked us if we wanted to start dating, that we needed to say, figure it out right then, yes or no, if we were going to date, or either that or, stop flirting with each other because we were being a bad example to everyone else, just being single and flirting, I guess. And so we decided in that meeting that we were going to start dating. And so they put together like a contract of rules for us to follow to court the correct way. We had to start off in a phase one where, there was no kissing or like touching or anything like that. And we had to be in group and like do group dating. So we could only see each other with other people around. And then, we would move into a phase two where we could be alone together and we could kiss, but it could only be standing up, no sitting down next to each other or laying down or, very specific rules when it comes to that kind of stuff. And they were very much involved in our engagement and rushing our engagement because you can't be engaged as a Christian and, be tempted to have sex before marriage and things like that. So as a Christian, you have to have a short engagement and hurry up and get married because you can't be tempted to have sex. So
How long was your engagement then?
5.5 months.
Okay.
So it all kind of happened real fast. And in hindsight, I wish I would have kind of had the chance to figure that all out myself. I don't know if I would have went through with all of that, but yeah. And then we became directors of the program that very next year after we were married. And so we were in full-time ministry and we were in charge of all of these college age students and finding homes for them through the church. And I don't know, it was just full-time ministry and being at the church constantly. That was our first year of marriage.
It's
And
a lot of changes quick, but it's just the whole system it's crazy to think about the systems. And I don't say it with complete surprise, even though I don't think I ever had rules quite like that. But I did go to Bob Jones for a year, which if you've heard of is very strict. And I think it's less about like the nitpicky rules. It's just, you just don't date. Like if you want to date somewhere else, that's fine. But like there was like a special room you could go and sit on chairs or whatever and talk to each other. But if you weren't in the dating room, you just didn't date. Like you don't get caught walking together. You don't, touch each other. It was just pretty much like a don't do it. And I didn't really date that much at the time, but I would imagine that there was a whole bunch of people that broke some rules and found loopholes, and because it's so restrictive. And I think it also sets people up to misunderstand whether they're really attracted to each other in a couple of ways. Like number one, if you are really wanting to fool around and you're like, I just really want to kiss this person and hold hands and so forth. And then you feel guilty because like, oh, I kind of disobeyed the leadership. It makes you think, oh, am I really listening to the Spirit of God if I'm willing to disobey my church leadership here? And so maybe this person isn't the right person for me because they're obviously leading me to sin. And it's like people might probably, I'm sure people threw away really good relationships purely because they felt like this person is leading me to sin. And they might have been a great pair in every sense. And it just, I think it really messes with people's minds and your ability to think through what a good person is. But also on the other side, if you're so restrictive and you truly, even if you obey all the rules, like you end up not really knowing what the person's really like. You know what they're like in this structure, but it's like you take the structure away and like, who's the real you? Who's left without with this rule book? Are you nice? Are you polite? Are you
That's
kind? Are
like
you respectful?
exactly that's like
Yeah, take it.
exactly like explains my first marriage.
Hmm. Well,
It's
tell us
like
more details.
what you just said. It was like we were before we got married, it was like, master's commission, traveling, all fun and games. We were going out and spreading the gospel, spending time at the church, worshiping and practicing our human videos, we called them. They were dramas to music, um, that had like a Christian undertone to it, like basically a music video
Hmm.
to music, telling some sort of Christian story. So we would practice those for hours, create these human videos, and it was all fun. We were all hanging out together. We would travel and we would do these things, um and then so we were all in a group together doing these fun and exciting things, traveling to exciting places. And then we got married and the program fizzled out and we were physically at the church more, and it was him and I at home more. And I'm like, oh my God, I don't even know you. I don't even know if I like you. Like, I don't even know if I would have picked this if,
Hmm.
you know, I don't know, had we not met in the environment that we met in. I mean, the reason why, I mean, and he's, now these days, I mean, I have no ill will towards him. He's a good person, I wish him well. I hope he's happy out there somewhere, but um I don't think that we really should have ever gotten married. I don't think that I just don't think I should have gone down that path. I wasn't really thinking about how permanent the marriage was. It was kind of a young and dumb thing. And I was so caught up in the ministry and all of the fun, exciting things that we were doing for God and Jesus. And then when things calmed down and it was him and I at home, I realized I didn't really know him. I wasn't sure if I liked what I did know. And um we just didn't mesh well, and we didn't think, we were not like-minded when
Hmm.
at the very end of it, looking back on it.
Was the initial main criteria just how well you would work together sharing the gospel? Like, was that pretty much the big
I
focus, or was there
This
any
is
sense of like, do you just actually like each other, or are you
I don't know.
attracted?
I loved the way he worshiped. And we worshiped so much in that program for hours and hours on a daily basis. And he was so passionate and into it. And back then I was like, wow, he really loves God. He loves Jesus. And he wants his whole life to be ministry. And
Hmm.
that was what I, at the time, was attracted to. And then realizing, obviously, that's not everything in a marriage.
Yeah, and ultimately, from where I'm standing, it's not even anything, really.
Anything at all.
Yeah. Well,
A hindrance.
when you were doing that, what was the timeline for when you first had the very first crack in the wall regarding your worldview? Like, how did that play out? And like, were you married for a few years before you had doubts? Like, when did your doubts first ever begin?
So, okay, so him and so we were in the program in Master's Commission for quite a few years. I moved out to Iowa. So I did my very first year of Master's Commission in Michigan around 2000. let me think, hold on, 4 or 5 when I was around 18. And then after that, so somewhere around like 2005, 2006 was when I moved out to Iowa and I became a part of the Master's Commission. And that was basically how me moving out to Iowa and going to Master's Commission is how I got thrown into the ministry, basically. And so that was around 2005, 2006. And I started questioning around the 2012 election. And so I was a skeptic. I was not open about saying I was an atheist, or even really honest with myself that whole last year that I was there, that I was a straight up atheist. But it was about 2012. So I was out there for about 6 years or so, in full-time ministry. And then around 2012, I started questioning. I started coming across debates online between theists and atheists. And I would listen to those, listen to both sides. I started seeing things about hell and the original words that hell was translated from, what they actually meant, and starting to rid of my theology of hell, that there was a literal hell. And then started finding out that there was no evidence for Jesus, no sufficient evidence for Jesus, I should say, at least sufficient enough for me. And that was news to me. Honestly, I really thought that the Bible was the most historically proven book in all of the world. That's what I really thought. I thought it was infallible, that there was no error whatsoever, that it was a direct word from God. And I was very, very unaware of a lot of the immoral things within the Old Testament. And so at that time, I was continuing on Bible courses because I had only had my associate license. And so I continued on so I could get my bachelor's. And so continuing on in those classes was opening up my eyes to the flaws of the Bible. And I was questioning that last year or so, and I left. It's coming up on 9 years now, but I left in September of 2013. And so I was there for about a year, really just not believing. And things started to slowly fizzle out. I started to let go of some of my responsibilities in leadership over some areas and wanting to pass it off onto other people. I really wasn't interested. I couldn't teach kids church anymore. I did not feel comfortable doing anything with kids church other than like playing games with them and coloring. I did not want to teach them things about the Bible. I just felt it was so wrong. And especially because it seemed like they really focused on wanting to teach them Old Testament stories, which I just thought was completely messed up. And so, or just the whole doctrine of hell. There was no way I was going to be telling children about that. So then I started really struggling with whether or not homosexuality was actually wrong. And just the way that I knew that the church would behave if somebody was actually a part of that community wanting to come and be a part of our church. Would they be an equal to us? And I really didn't feel like they would be.
Right.
And so I was struggling with that. And I kept it a secret. I didn't tell my ex-husband, my husband at the time, that I was having these doubts. I was listening to Seth Andrews' podcast a lot at the time, listening to The Thinking Atheist.
Mm-hmm.
And I liked listening to him because it wasn't like hardcore atheist content. It was softer. I didn't feel offended by a lot of the stuff he was saying. And it really started to make me think. And so obviously I started looking into whether or not the Bible was really infallible. And it didn't take long for me to kind of find out that it wasn't. But eventually he saw some conversations in my phone about not believing in God. And so he questioned me about it. And so then it did come out in the open. And the senior pastor knew, but nobody else really knew. They kept it kind of quiet. They didn't really want anybody to know. Um,
Hmm. That's a crazy journey. Can I ask just a few steps earlier, when you were going through this and you were kind of quietly deconverting, I would imagine that there was a bit of a grieving process, realizing that you'd been lied to perhaps by other teachers and pastors, that you had been part of this, that you had a hope of heaven that wasn't founded in reality, that you had this relationship with God that wasn't anything. For most people that go through that, when they're realizing that this is either not real or probably not real, it's like pulling the carpet out of under your feet, as they say, and you're just kind of left floundering. What were the hardest parts, still before you made it public, but what were the hardest parts for you as you grappled with these, as you wrestled with these questions, and as you moved away from believing? What were the hardest things to let go of?
um, yeah, I was really heartbroken to find out that I didn't have a savior I could lean on anymore. I felt very frustrated that realizing how much prayer really didn't work, and realizing how many unanswered prayers I had over all those years. I was really upset at the thought of leaving and losing the community.
Hmm.
I was really sad at the idea that there wasn't a heaven. I was um I was really sad at all of the missed opportunities that I had, because I was now a part of, very, very, very much a part of the church, to the point that I dropped out of high school, took Bible college courses, and the only experience throughout my entire 20s was church ministry. And that I didn't know where I was going to go from there. I was, at the time I was 20, almost 27 years old, and yeah, I was young, but I was starting from scratch and I knew it,
Yeah. Did you
to get
what
back
were
out into the
there
real world.
did you have kids at this point yet when you were having the doubts?
Yes. So when I actually left in 2013, my daughter was almost 4. So she was about 3.5 at the time. So yeah, I started questioning probably around the time that she was 2.5, 3 years old.
Okay. But it was early enough in her life that you were able to keep from having heavily indoctrinated her too much. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I
That's great.
really don't believe that she was really indoctrinated at all.
Hmm.
Because that was one of the main reasons I felt like, oh, I need to save my daughter from this life. I don't want her to be a part of this. I don't want her to learn about this or think that any of this stuff is true. And so I felt a strong need of kind of saving my daughter and getting her out of there.
Hmm.
Um,
That's
she
awesome.
was very much too young to remember any of that. The only like memory she has is when she goes out there now to go visit her dad,
Hmm.
and she doesn't like it. I mean,
Yeah.
not that she doesn't like him. She likes, I mean the
Yeah.
church and those
The whole life.
teachings. Yeah.
When you began to realize you were walking away from Christianity, did you? I have actually a couple questions about this, but the first one was it an assumption that your marriage would end for sure if you did this? Or did you think maybe he'll respect that I'm just on a different journey and we can find other common grounds? Like, was it like, if I, like, the minute that I make it clear I am not a Christian, pretty much, whether it takes 6 months or 6 years, but my marriage is, I've pretty much killed it at that point. How did you approach that?
So yes, with my ex-husband finding out, he was the one I was most afraid of, him finding out that I no longer believed, because we were leaders in the church. I did not know what that was going to end up looking like if I didn't believe anymore and he wanted to stay working at the church, being a pastor. I just didn't feel like it was going to work out well for me to stay home. And what were we going to do with our daughter eventually? Was she going to go with him? Was she going to stay with me? How are we going to raise her? um well, so I offered, when he found out, to if he would sit and listen to me talk and show him the things that I have come across, to why I reached the conclusion that I did. And so I was really hoping to have a cordial conversation and kind of work through it and see what we could figure out. But I mean, initial conversations, any conversations that we had, did not go that way at all. He was very much not interested in hearing any of my thoughts. He did not want to know why. Um, I I'm assuming maybe because he was so indoctrinated in it. And in that world, you really truly believe that if somebody's walking away, they're backsliding and it's Satan and it's a sin. And so, I think to him, he probably felt like he wanted to stay away from the wickedness than really thinking that maybe I've come across some sort of truth. And
Hmm.
so it didn't take very long after that for the marriage to crumble. Um, and also, it made things very difficult because within that denomination, according to the bylaws in Open Bible, as a pastor, you can't stay a pastor if you have gone through a divorce,
Hmm.
unless it, follows scripture in the way of, where divorce is okay in instances like physical abuse,
Adultery.
maybe drugs, or, alcohol, or whatever it could be, or denouncing your faith. So
Hmm.
I did feel the need to be open about denouncing my faith. So if he wanted to continue on as a pastor, he could, because I felt the pressure of, if I'm honest about this, I'm going to destroy his whole life, everything that he does.
Hmm.
And at the time, I didn't really think of it as, "Oh, maybe I could do this and save him from it." But it was more so, this is his choice. He wants to stay in it. And I don't really want to ruin his life. I kind of just want to walk away quietly and start over, go back to where my family is in Ohio. And that's mostly what I tried to do. Um, was just walk away quietly. But it was very hard to walk away. I mean, the church and the pastor and the board members, they were all very, very involved in everything, involved in me, and involved in our marriage, and obviously knew that I was questioning, obviously knew that I didn't want to be a part of it anymore because he had shared that information with the pastor. And so when I tried to leave, get on a bus and go home with my daughter, suitcase, and um her and I, and that was it. That's all I had when I went back. I let him keep everything. I was like, I don't want to take anything from you. I don't want to ruin your life. I just want out of here. And um it drove the senior pastor nuts. My husband also had another job, driving a bus at the time, so he was gone. There's city bus, and so he was gone during the day working. And I was packing up to leave the day I was leaving, and the senior pastor wanted to know if I was coming for some sort of meeting up at the church, and I told him no, and not coming back at all. So see you later. Have a nice life. So I he called me 33 times that day, showed up to my house, banging on the door, screaming my name outside the house like 8 times that day, freaking out that I was leaving and not going to be a part of the church anymore. Wanted to talk, wanted to save me from leaving and backsliding and whatever else. And it was really creepy. And so um I left and went back to Ohio, and then they publicly shunned me from the pulpit about 2 weeks later. And I had church members like hounding me and getting a hold of me, wanting to pray and talk and try to bring me back. And Ashley,
Hmm.
you know what you experienced. You know what God has done for you in your life, and how could you leave? And a lot of good sentiments and a lot of people that truly cared, but it was intense. It was too much. And some of it was angry. Some people were very aggressive and mean. And I felt the need to literally fall off the face of the earth. I deleted all social media for almost 8 years, about 7.5 years or so.
Hmm.
And um well, maybe it was about 7 years, because I've been on social media for almost 2 years now.
Yeah.
Or about 2 years now, finally. But I had to fall off the face of the planet basically, because they were just so in my face about walking away and leaving. And it was too intense for me. So
Yeah.
needless to say, we did end up going through a divorce, and we divorced at the end of 2014.
Hmm.
And it's really weird looking back on all of it after all of this time. We still never really talked about it. It was really abrupt, and there was no like him trying to get me back, me trying to get him back. Um he was very turned off by the atheism thing. I was very turned off by the Christian thing, and it fizzled out. We moved on with our lives. We now co-parent. He sees her just a couple times a year. I have custody of her, so she's with me like 90% of the time. But it is frustrating having to share custody with somebody who's a pastor out there and very much believes that and thinks that everything that I believe and could be teaching our daughter is just evil and wicked.
Yeah. Can I dive into that a little bit?
Yeah.
The whole idea of what you talked about with, you didn't really have closure, and there was no expectation or no sense of him trying to win you back. That particular part I wanted to dive into more. When you're a Christian, obviously the deepest desire of your heart is to, in terms of when you're looking into yourself, your deepest desire of your heart is to get your eyes off of sin, get your eyes on the Lord, and focus on the things of the Lord, take your eyes off the things of the earth and then put them on heaven, and to truly be, worshiping God and thanking him for salvation. But beyond, when you turn it from your deepest desire for what's inside of you to the world, your deepest desire is obviously to win people to Christ, to be a true soul winner, um, to help people escape, obviously, the fires of hell, to understand the beauty of the Lord and of the gospel of salvation, and for them to understand what the beauty of the kingdom is, what life could be like and will be like when the Lord starts his kingdom here on earth. And in a sense, I'm building this up a little bit, but in a sense, the biggest thing you could do, the best thing you could do with your life is to love people to Christ. And you would think, in a sense, that the biggest place where that would be focused for most people is, of course, your family, your loved ones. To say, I want to obviously bring the strangers into the kingdom. I want to bring everyone I can into the kingdom, but I for sure want to bring my loved ones into the kingdom. Of anyone that I expect to see it, on the other side of the banks of Jordan, I expect to see my parents, my kids, my aunts and uncles and cousins, and I'm at least going to do my best for them. And obviously, I want my circle of influence to expand exponentially beyond that. But in a marriage, of course, that's exponentially more important, to say, this person with whom I'm sharing a life, with whom I've been, emotionally, physically close for so long, I definitely want to bring them into the kingdom. And I would have expected in my life, and it sounds like you would have expected too, that one of the responses to leaving would be to basically win you back through the love of Christ. And there's a passage, I think it's in 1 Peter, 2 Peter, that talks about, if your spouse is not a believer, win them back by your good behavior. And that idea, taking it further to say, assuming that there's no abuse going on, assuming it's just two otherwise normal people that can be respectful to each other, to say, look, I got won from the world and sin and the devil and my selfishness to Christ because of Christ's love. But I'm now a mirror of Christ's love to the world, and Christ's love is shining in my heart. I'm going to reflect it to you. And even though you don't think you see Christ as real, I'm going to show you how much his love is real. And I'm going to win you back, because it's just, it's going to be so attractive. And, whether you're a Christian or another religion or atheist, I would assume that most people who really are in a good relationship are sending the vibe out to say, I really care about you. Like, I want you to feel like if you went somewhere else, if you went to a different relationship, not that I'd ever want you to be tempted to, but if you did go to some other relationship, you would be getting less good treatment. You'd be treated worse than me, because I'm going to do my best to care about you, to listen to you, to think about you, to bless your socks off. I want you to feel like it's just, this person cares so deeply about me. When they go to the store, they can't go shopping without thinking, I wonder what, that person would really like to eat tonight, for food, or what, something, a gift that says, I'm thinking about you. Or if you're, looking at your phone, can I send them a text that say, hey, I'm thinking about you. I appreciate what you did yesterday. All these little ways that we can express love, or, kind touches throughout the day, or hugs, ways that just build the other person up, so the other person feels connected and loved and cared about. And the beauty of that is so powerful, obviously, especially for people that are wounded, where like, I just feel like, the world's against me. No one loves me. And all of a sudden you've got this person that's just, they'll bend over backwards to just love you and care about you and bless you. And you would think, in the context of Christianity, that they would think to themselves, I know that God's a God of miracles. He's the God who, like you said with Abraham, when all hope seems lost, he comes through. When it's your darkest hour, when it's the 11th hour, he shines the brightest. And just because in our humanness we lose hope or lose perspective, that has nothing to do with the reality of what God is doing. And so I want to keep my eyes focused on God. And I would think that somebody would say, Ashley's leaving. The thing she needs most in this world is to come back home, not to the marriage, but to Jesus, come home to Jesus. And to say, if that's the most important thing in the world right now, is for Ashley to come home to Jesus, then the only thing that I should be caring about is what I can do to further that reality, that outcome of Ashley coming back to Jesus. Therefore, I'm going to love you to the nth degree, so that you just basically say, you know what? I can see the love of Christ in you. I can see it as clear as day. You are living the love of Christ for me. And yet, so many of us, it's the exact opposite. And I wanted to ask maybe two questions about it. Number one, what do you think you would have done if the roles were reversed? Would you have tried to love him back if you were still a Christian? And then, I guess, to get to the reality of it all, why do you think Christians are so hateful when you leave?
I don't know. That's hard to say, because I would really like to think that I wouldn't have nagged or argued or been impatient, that I would have been patient and tried to be a safe haven, for them to come and feel like they could. My whole life, I've always tried to be the type of person that is open and not judgmental, aside from Christianity, that if somebody wants to come and talk to me and they've done something they shouldn't have done, or feeling something they shouldn't have done, that I'm a safe person to talk to.
Hmm.
So I feel like there would have definitely been a level of that to me, that would have tried to be patient and wait it out, and maybe love that person through it. And I don't know why some people don't do that. I don't know why, for some people, their initial reaction is almost like vindictive, or like desperate, angry, aggressive. And it's almost like they must be thinking that they're fighting the devil or something. And that's a justification for that sort of anger or aggression. and not really realizing that they're actually doing this to a real person.
Yeah, agreed. Would you say then, I think you used the word, but would you say that you felt like they were treating you like you're a traitor to the church and to Jesus?
Oh yeah, very much so. They very much thought that I was, quite a few people thought that I was demon possessed,
Hmm.
things like that. Yeah, that I had the devil in me and that I was evil.
And you mentioned, I think your husband didn't really ask you why you left. Did anyone ask you? Like in a
Not really.
hmm,
Oddly enough, all the hundreds of people, the first whys, I guess, like, why did you leave? Why don't you believe this anymore? Have really only been in the last year or so of any of those people from the church. When I decided to get back online, get on social media, get a Facebook again and stuff like that, and be open about my atheism, I did reconnect with quite a few people from my world out there, in Michigan and Ohio here, but also out in Iowa. And I finally started getting people asking me why, or I get it now, or can you tell me more? I'm starting to question now. You're starting to make me wonder. You've stuck with it all these years. You're still an atheist. It wasn't just a phase.
hmm.
It wasn't that you just wanted to get out of your marriage. And so I think time has really helped. But yeah, initially, and before I'd cut off connection with all of these people, nobody asked why. Nobody wanted to know why.
Hmm. Do you think that there's a sense of intimidation? Like, you were a pastor, so in a sense, you were on the inside circle. You had the keys. You had probably the literal keys to the church, but you had the keys to the kingdom. Anything that they could have told you, Ashley, let's open the Bible to such and such a passage. Let's do this. Let's talk about this topic. Let's look at this theologically. You could have probably did have some sermons you'd preached on it. Do you think there was an intimidation factor of like, yeah, we wanted to win her back, but what are we going to say? She knows everything we're going to say, and she could probably say it better than we could. So, like,
Yes,
what do we do at this point?
very much so. That is how conversations have kind of always gone. I mean, if you understand the Bible even a little bit, it's really not hard to have a logical rebuttal to a lot of these things being said because you have the knowledge of the doctrine. And so a lot of the time the conversations would go, but been there, done that. I've heard it already. I already know. Or I would have some sort of logical explanation to something that they've said. And so I think for the most part, a lot of people, they didn't even want to attempt a conversation with me or anything because of that, I think.
Hmm.
I pretty much always have a response to something. And it was a little harder there at the beginning. Obviously, I defend and have better responses now, 9 years later, than I did at the beginning, but it definitely didn't help any of them. The fact that, like, I if I walked away, they could walk away then. So if they have that conversation with me and find out why, there's probably going to be a pretty good reason for the most part. And I think that for a lot of those people, they didn't want to face that reality.
Hmm.
They probably didn't want to hear what I had to say because to some extent they knew it probably made sense.
Yeah. Do you did you when you were going through that? Do you think that part of it too, it all was the idea of, I think you alluded to this, but just that when you're go through certain religious experiences and you really think that you've actually tasted the goodness of the Lord, where he's spoken to you, he's moved, he's opened doors, he's done miracles, that it's almost like if someone said to you, Ashley, you don't have a daughter, be like, well, I know she's there. I physically see her. Like, you could tell me all day long, I don't have one. She's right here. I can open the door and she's right there. And for someone to say, Ashley, or for you to say, your God isn't there, to them, it's almost, it's not quite the same, but it's almost the same as them saying, I have sensed him so much. you might as well tell me that my kids or my spouse isn't here, even though they're right there. He's right here. Like, I can sense him. You can't tell me he doesn't exist. Like, how do you think that the experience plays into it, where there's no, like, I guess I'm saying is, do you think it cuts off the capacity to look at the data? Like, if you were to say, let's talk about what I'm learning, whether you were, looking at the Greco-Roman mystery cults, or you're looking at some of the things that the New Testament copies from outside of the Old Testament, whether you're looking at other religions, comparative mythology, whatever the issue is that you could bring up and say, let's talk about it, or let's talk about failed prophecies, let's talk about the discrepancies in the Bible, let's talk about the fact that there weren't 4 gospels, there were 60 and probably hundreds originally. Whatever the topic you could bring up, if someone can just say, yeah, but God's real, I've sensed him. Like, whatever you could bring up that could lead you to the conclusion, therefore your God's not real, I can say, I already know he's real. Like, that's not an option to go there. Do you think that cuts people off? Is that fair to say that cuts people off from critical thinking? Because the conclusion of God is alive and real is kind of cemented,
Yeah, it definitely does. That's basically somebody just not overcoming cognitive dissonance at all. I mean, you there's a justification no matter what, and that's kind of why indoctrination is so dangerous, because of the indoctrination, you're stunted to think beyond that, because you're going to resort back to the circular thinking of, well, yeah, but there's some sort of explanation, and keep circling back to it. And I don't know, but also at the same time, I really feel like that there's some people feel very strongly that there are some people that are just so indoctrinated that it's almost impossible for them to see the reality of it. I personally don't know how I feel about that. I don't know, but I don't know. There's got to be something important, like super important, about continuing on with just giving the facts, because even if that person may not ever physically speak, the fact that they understand that they're going through cognitive dissonance and that what you're saying makes sense, or these facts make sense, maybe they'll never verbally speak that, but you never know what's happening internally. And
Yeah.
so I don't know. I mean, I don't really feel like anybody's too far indoctrinated to ever reach a point of reality. Um, but I think for a lot of people, it is really hard, and that it does make the conversation very hard, because they will not give it up no matter what.
Yeah. I know too, you mentioned, or you were recently interviewed by a good friend of mine, Jonathan Pierce. And one of the things he brings up a lot is the idea of the terror theory, that it's not just that you're mentioning facts to review, like, hey, did you know there's discrepancies between the gospels, or whatever issue you'd bring up. But it's the idea that if we take this rabbit trail to its logical conclusion, the implication is that the Bible's not infallible, therefore it's just purely man-made, and therefore maybe the underlying premises aren't real. That those are like the surface, but kind of like a mountain that's full of lava underneath that's going to spew out at some point. The underlying lava is, there's no afterlife. And the
Yeah.
idea of that for some people is so terrorizing that they have to just pretty much, as we used to do as kids, la 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 la, I can't hear you. You basically, you can't get too close to the implication that there's no afterlife for a lot of people, because that if even if you're not saying that, even if you're like, I've never said that to you, but even if you get close enough with the implication, that begins to kind of surreptitiously, stealthily terrorize people to think, I can't go there, especially if they're like super leaning on seeing a loved one. Maybe like for me, I feel like I've lost grandparents and so forth, but I don't feel like I've lost like a brother or a sister, or my mom's still alive. I haven't lost my own children at all. But like, if you have someone that you lost that was like, their life was really cut short, like this was just so unfair, and you feel like life can't be right unless I see him again. you bring those kind of concepts in, and I think that's part of what's going on is people just can't take it. They just can't take the idea that maybe I'm just a really cool evolved animal. And just like we wouldn't expect a frog heaven or a turtle heaven or a fox heaven, but there's the Homo sapiens don't get a special heaven just because we're not Homo sapiens. I think that's just, it terrorizes people.
It really does. And I have definitely kind of experienced some of that, because I've been kind of open and blunt about that. I made a video on hell. That was the first video I ever made on my YouTube. And that caused a lot of issues.
I'll bet.
I was like, yeah, I mean, that caused a lot of issues within my family. My grandma doesn't talk to me. My dad and my stepmom and some of my cousins and my aunts literally cut off connection when I shared my YouTube video on hell and the afterlife, and the fact that there's nothing that really supports an afterlife. And all of that scared the hell out of them. And in a way, I feel horrible for that. But also at the same time, I mean, I want to save people from being scared of that. I think it's horrible that people are grown adults and they're literally afraid of ridding of this hateful belief because they're afraid they're going to be tortured in hell forever. And there's a part of me that's like, a big part of me that's like, we need to keep talking about this. Guys, there's no reason to think that there is an actual literal hell. Please don't be afraid of this. Don't waste your life being afraid of this.
Yeah, well said. I was curious on the note of their responses to you. A lot of Christians, or excuse me, a lot of deconverted Christians, and agnostics and atheists, they go through an angry atheist phase, as they say. Do you feel like you went through an angry atheist phase, and like how have you learned to be more patient or gracious with people? Because I know that's a big challenge. I certainly feel that challenge myself, and kind of letting it go, to quote Frozen, letting things go. And so I've got a little girl that loves Frozen. We've watched it only a few dozen times, but to let it go and to say, what, if you really want to live your life stuck in mythology, have at it. And I don't mean to let it go in the total sense like we should still fight, especially when it relates to, like, people don't usually just stop and say, I just want to go to church. They're like, you have to go to church too, and you all have to go to church, and especially the kids, they need to be indoctrinated. So it's like we shouldn't stop our attempts to change culture, but just in terms of like individual friends, where say it's a friend of yours that just really believes, like, I wouldn't want to live without Jesus. Jesus gives me meaning, hope, purpose, delight. He gives me joy. I wouldn't want a life without Jesus. So let me have my Jesus. And obviously, at certain points, you just have to let them have their Jesus. How do you deal with being gracious and patient? And how's that? Like, how was your angry atheist phase? How did that go down, if you had one?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it still rears its ugly head. I definitely went through an angry atheist phase, and I would have to say that I probably became a little less angry maybe only about a year or two ago. And how I dealt with that, I don't know. It was almost like I had to change my approach, because I was losing relationships with people in my family who still very much believed and felt I was very harsh. And I don't, it was just a realization that I've had in the last year of, I really need to change the way that I talk about this, because I need to talk about this in a way that's beneficial for both the atheist and the believer. I would like to talk about things in such a way that a believer doesn't feel uncomfortable. I would like to be the type of person that talks about it in the way that gives the type of comfortability that Seth Andrews gave me when I was listening to his stuff. The reason why I listened to his stuff was because he didn't overly mock. He wasn't overly angry. He wasn't mean about Christians or anything like that. And when I realized the importance of being out there and open about this, and the responsibility that I hold in my words, and the influence that it has on people from my past or that I'm meeting now, I have to take a softer approach because I don't want to turn away atheists. I don't want to turn theists away. I want I want to be somebody that a theist feels comfortable to talk to or listen to, and to feel okay to question and to not feel like they're going to be mocked. And so I think that that is my underlying um motivation, is for theists, family theists of mine, or strangers or whoever, people from my past, to feel comfortable and to not feel like they're going to be judged by me in any way or made fun of.
Yeah, it's a good point. I definitely struggle with it too. I've in the last year or two, I've probably called a couple people cult leaders, and they're just elders at a church, but I've called them cult leaders, and I've said you're in a cult and you're actually leading a cult, and that pretty much killed their friendship. But I guess people don't like being called cult leaders, but it's true. They are cult leaders, and I think it's kind of like, when we were Christians, we would have talked about the idea of from whom much is given, much is expected. And, if you have a greater light, you have, if you're someone that's been exposed to the gospel many, many times, clearly, you're going to be judged much more harshly, more likely in the afterlife by God than someone that's just in the jungle and the only light they've had is, the sun, the moon, and the stars. And in that sense, I'm like, you who are in leadership in a church, you're not passively just attending. You're actually leading people into indoctrination. And so I hold you to a different standard. And I do kind of, I go after the apologists. I go after the people like that. And it's funny. I don't know if you do this at all, or do this. Maybe if you don't, I recommend it. But people ask me sometimes, why do you have Christians on your channel? And I don't do it much. And it's part of it is I truly like to talk to Christians. I like to hear what they have to say. But part of it is I think it helps people that are on the fence to realize how bad their answers are. And I'm like, I'm not trying to mock them per se. I'm not trying to make them look bad. I want them to just come on and share their real heart about things.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I'm like, hey, you Christians who are on the fence, listen, this is your hero. This is one of your leaders in the church community. Listen to their answers. How good does it sound? And usually the answer is they don't sound like they're very convincing. They sound like they've got really poor answers. And I kind of feel like, hey, Christians, keep talking. You're digging the hole deeper. Like, hey, Mr. Apologist, give us your answers. Hey, Frank Turek, hey, Kent Hovind, keep talking. And I don't obviously want them to keep talking. They're really bad guys. But in a sense, I'm like saying tongue in cheek, keep talking, because the more you talk, the stupider you sound, and you're doing my job for me. So have at it. Keep talking. Dig that hole deeper. But I was also, I know I've kept you for a while, so I wanted to jump into a few final questions here. I wanted to ask you about the kind of the end of your journey, as you're going from where you were to here. A couple quick questions. Number one, how has MS played a role in this? And kind of, I guess, a little related, how are you healing from the trauma that, would you say you were traumatized at all by religious indoctrination? And how have the last few years been in terms of not your platform, not your debates or whatever, but just you and the quietness of your own heart, no longer obviously speaking to a mythological Canaanite demigod, but talking to yourself, like doing the self-talk. How are you reprogramming your worldview in a healthier sense? You can tackle those whichever order you like.
Okay, so my worldview has changed in such a way that I really, really started to get to know myself, love myself, and be proud of myself, leaning on myself, all sorts of things, realizing how much I'm personally capable of without a God, and that it was me the whole time. And I really do enjoy the quietness, even without the prayer. I did miss the prayer for some time, especially if I was having some hard times. So it was harder when I was working through some emotions, but I've over the years, journaled, put music on, sobbed, talked to somebody, um, or just let time heal a little bit. It was a lot harder for a while to realize that I didn't actually have a savior or a God up there to help me through these harder, desperate situations. There wasn't somebody hearing my prayers. And so it pushed me into action to do things for myself, to lean on myself. And um I'm trying to remember, what was your very first question that you asked in all of that?
Just how MS played a role in your
That's
journey as
right.
well.
So MS, I got diagnosed in 2016. So it was 3 years after I left and became an atheist. So how that played a role was I never believed this. I had been about 2.5 years out or so when I was diagnosed with it. And but I had, some people in my life, specifically my stepmother, telling me things like, because I walked away, God cursed me with this because I'm a sinner, that
Hmm.
God gave me this disease. And obviously I knew that was just bullshit and a complete lie. And but it made me very angry. It made
Like
me
God was
very
getting back
angry
at
that,
you.
yeah, that God was getting back at me. Um, that now I had this, and this is how people view me, that, oh, I walked away and now I'm going to slowly just fade away from diseases because I'm such a sinner. And, but at the same time, I went without medication for a couple of years while first diagnosed with MS. And I was relapsing one after another, and my MS got really aggressive. I had a very hard time dealing with it. I was very emotional, very depressed, not knowing how bad it was going to progress. At that point, I was having trouble walking. I was needing a cane, and I couldn't go more than 5 feet without some sort of walking device. It was bad. I got a 2 centimeter lesion on my brain stem down here, and that really affected my equilibrium and my balance, and couldn't
Hmm.
tell where the freaking ground was. Felt like I was free falling or going through an earthquake or walking on water constantly. It was the craziest thing. I've had intense vertigo for since 2017 now. Um, so about 5 years coming up. I've had vertigo 24/7 because of that. And
Hmm.
that kind of rocked my world a little bit. And I was not able to go to my family for support. They didn't want to talk about it. It was hard for them. They ignored it. I didn't have anyone to go to except for my now husband. And even to the point where they were I was having my stepmom and stuff telling me things like, don't bother your family with this burden. You need to go to a support group and talk to other people with MS who care. Um, because really, what is going to help you is that you need to come back to God and pray. Stop bothering us with this.
Hmm.
And you're burdening your family. And so I stopped talking to them about it and have leaned on myself. And um, through all of that, like I was telling you earlier, I have been on a new medication, Ocrevus, for the last 2, 3 years or so. I can't remember exactly, but um, it has been, I guess, for lack of better words, a godsend. Not really a godsend, thanks to science. It's I have been in remission and feeling so much more like a normal person. I am now on medication for depression and anxiety too. I'm on 2 anti-anxiety medications. And I'd have to say that due to the fact that I have completely walked away from that stuff, I've put up boundaries with people who say hateful and ignorant things like that. And I've taken rational and logical steps now to be on proper medication to help slow down the progression of my MS, to be on medication to help with my mental illnesses, things that I deal with there. And thanks to these medications created by science, I am much better, much closer to normal than I was before. So I'd have to say, walking away and letting science do its job has helped me more than staying in it and expecting God to pray. So
Hmm.
MS has affected me in a way that it's been very frustrating at times to not do what I want to do because my body's not working the way I want it to work at times. But I feel mentally and emotionally stronger, way, way, way stronger than I was back then. I have put some real time in the last few years in relying on myself and becoming a strong, independent, awesome freaking woman compared to what I was then. I don't have to have a man of God behind me. I don't have to have a God above me. It's just me.
Hmm. That's so awesome. It's like you're claiming your own strength and power and voice, and it's a beautiful thing to see. And it's true, and it's amazing to realize that it's not just that you're effectively saying I don't need a God. You're also making clear he was never there in the first place. It was always you. So even when you
Yeah.
thought your strength was from God, it was always you anyway. So it's getting back to reality. And I feel so bad about the hatefulness about saying like you deserved this or God got you back. I've seen this. I'm sure people could tell lots of stories that could spin our heads around with this kind of stuff, but I've only seen it that vindictively once before in my life. And what you just said was pretty extreme, but there was this couple when I was growing up, I was a preteen maybe. And there was this couple that had 3 kids and their marriage was on the rocks. And I remember hearing through the grapevine, as you do, that they had gone to the pastor for counseling. And I don't think that was like an affair or anything. It was just, they just weren't compatible. And they were thinking about divorcing. And the pastor said, don't be deceived. As the Bible says, God is not mocked. Whatever you sow, you will reap. And I think that's in James. And he said, if you do this divorce, you are flying in the face of what God asks you to do. And he will not let you go unpunished for this. And about a year later, they did it. And about a year later, they had three kids. Their youngest child was a girl who she had muscular dystrophy. So she would walk, like when she'd walk, it would walk like this. For having gone through that trouble, she was one of the sweetest little girls on the planet. I mean, just a beautiful spirit. And she went over to a girlfriend's house one night as like a 8 or 9-year-old for a sleepover, and they had a house fire. And she and all the other girl, her girlfriend, died as 9-year-olds or so. And I remember, as you could imagine, when I'm about to say the punchline, the parents of that little girl got it straight up. See, I told you, God cannot be mocked. Look what happened. It cost you divorced. It cost you your daughter's life. And I mean, what a mind job to do to people. Just
having to have that guilt on you.
Yeah, it's unbelievable. I mean, I had it a little bit
Wrong.
with like your insomnia is your fault because of sin, but to have your little girl's death on your hands because of you divorced, it's crazy. Well, I do want to ask kind of a final question. Number one, if there's anything, I should say 2 things. If there's anything in your story that we missed, feel free to add it. If anything you wanted to say that I didn't get to, but also just in general, I like to kind of end on a note of how would you contrast your life in terms of the peace that you had before deconversion, and it kind of relating to the healing, but just in a very generic sense, how would you say life is different now that you're an atheist? You
My
can take
life
that any
is
direction you want.
my life is different now in the sense that I can do what I want when I want now. Meaning that because I was so deeply involved in ministry, I was there all the time. The doors were open. Anytime anything was going on, I was expected to be there before and after the event, helping, doing everything, serving, always serving, always being there. Even if I didn't want to, even if I didn't feel good, if I was tired, if I just felt like staying home and watching a movie and hanging out on a Sunday or whatever day or time it was, not having the ability to do that because it was very much drilled in us to fight through that, fight through that suffering. God is worth it. He's worth it to worship and evangelize for and serve. And so you're going to fight through the tiredness, the not wanting to, and whatever else it may be. Now I don't have to do that. I don't have these responsibilities of having to be there when Christmas or Easter pop up and preparing for outreaches, being there to clean up as afterwards, set up beforehand, and be there for hours on end to pray for people and talk, and having my phone available 24/7 for people to contact me, to counsel them or whatever. I now can just live in peace, and I can go somewhere if I want to go. I can take breaks from things if I want to take breaks. I can enjoy my weekends, my weekdays. I'm so much more of a homebody than I was then. And if I do go out, it's because I want to go out. If I travel anywhere, it's for pleasure. It's because I want to. It's not because I'm on missions.
Yeah. It's a good point. It's a good point. I don't often think about it in those terms, but that's a really good point. And it really does, Christianity and missions and all that, it takes up so much of your time and mental energy. And even when you're not doing something, just the mental energy of constantly being in prayer. And, if I've done enough devotional time today, have I read enough commentaries to feel like I'm learning more about the scripture? There's just so much of your life that it consumes. And it really does feel like in some ways, like you're getting your life back. I mean, you can't get the time back that's passed, obviously, but like at least the time that's left, whatever we can to use our time to leave this planet better than we found it. It's like, I'm actually using my time for good things now, and for
Yeah.
real things, as opposed to mythology. And especially once you realize that this was just mythology, it's like, holy
Hmm.
smokes, what was I in? Like this, I was wasting my time. Like it's, I'll keep this short. But it always annoys me when I see like a debate, and I still stay in these Christian Facebook groups because I just want to hear what they're saying. But like
Yeah.
I'll see these debates about Arminianism, Calvinism, and post-millennialism, premillennialism. I'm like, it doesn't matter. None of it's real. Like you're debating about, whether Thor is better than Loki. It's like, it doesn't matter. It's mythology. It's like, it's, or how does Santa Claus give gifts to everybody in one night? Like, it doesn't matter. It's not real. And they're debating it like it's like, this is really serious. We got to figure out how Santa Claus delivers packages in one night. It's like, it's not real, people. And
Are you
I,
pre-trib or are you post-trib?
yeah, exactly. It's like, this just doesn't matter. And it really blows my mind. I'm so glad I just got to say, this going back to my story a little bit. I am so glad I got out. I can't,
Yeah.
it's been night and day. The freedom, not just the freedom with time, like you mentioned, but just the mental freedom to think,
Yeah.
I don't have a worldview that's dominated by fear, by shame, by threats, and just the bizarreness. Like you realize you were in something really bizarre. I don't know if you relate to this, but when I think about things like someone saying, eat his flesh and drink his blood, I'm like, this is a human sacrifice death cult I was in. And the idea
Blood
to me of
cult.
blood cult, and the idea of, this ancient Canaanite demigod named Yahweh wants and demands that you cut off the end of little boys' penises. Like, what the hell was I in? And it
Yeah.
really, it gets sick as you step back from it. You're like, when you're in it, you're like, no, it's not blood magic and circumcision is important. When you step back, you're like, bullshit. None of it was important. It was all garbage. It was all mythology. And it's really just weird. This is weird ass stuff. And I
It's
was
very weird.
I was not just in it. I was in it to win it. I was a preacher. I was just like, I wasn't a pastor, but I preached many times. I evangelized. I did soup kitchens. I shared the gospel with so many people. And it's like, what the hell was this? And that's, I think, part of my passion. I'm sure you'd agree with this, is it isn't just that we're trying to get people to escape. It's that we're trying to say, like, look, if you want to stay in this, fine, whatever. It's your life. Live it how you want. But before you commit to living your life for Jesus or the gospel or the kingdom, figure one thing out. Where the hell did this thing come from? Because if you don't know where Christianity and Judaism came from, then you're just winging it culturally. You're just giving what your parents and your grandparents gave you. You don't actually know where this came from. If you want to live it, fine. But first, just step back from the edge a little bit and dig deep into where this thing came from. And I will admit, and I to my shame, when I was a Christian, I did not know where this thing came from, and I should have.
Yeah.
But you think you go to Bible college and you go to, do mission school, all these things. I also went to mission school to do tribal evangelism in a jungle where they don't have a Bible yet. And you think, when you're
what was the program called? Were you in a program?
Yeah, it was called New Tribes Mission. If you're familiar with Wycliffe Bible Translators, it's kind of like that. But they would go to places where there's usually in a jungle, some kind of tribal environment where the people speak a language but have never written it down, most likely. So they have no alphabet, therefore no books. And there's a lot of, you'd be surprised how many groups there are still like that in the world. And so you would go, you'd learn the language, the culture for a few years. Eventually you'd help them develop an alphabet. And then once they have it, you'd teach them the alphabet. And then you'd actually get people that could, that were basically fluent now and not just speaking it, but writing it. And you'd get language helpers in the tribe to help you craft a Bible where you'd be saying it and say, what does this mean to you when I say this? And you make sure that you're saying it right. And you just spend years eventually crafting a Bible in their language and checking and rechecking. I mean, they just go through the nth degree to make sure, is this really translating accurately? Because some of the tribal languages are very complicated. But eventually the dream goal is to eventually get to a point where you can say, we now have a Bible, or at least the New Testament, and we're going to go through. New Tribes is well known for chronologically going through the Old Testament first. They talk about, the need for blood, the need for a spotless lamb. So when you get to Jesus and you see the blood, you see the spotlessness of Jesus as the lamb, it's the tribal people are like, oh, wow, Jesus is the fulfillment of God's requirement for the spotless lamb to be slaughtered. And tribal people are responding very, very positively in a lot of these cases, because they're like, their lives kind of suck. I mean, honestly, when you're if you're familiar with tribal groups, they obviously don't have great medical work going on. A lot of them, they're dying of diseases that they shouldn't, but also the women are usually treated very badly. What men in a lot of tribal groups can literally just take a stick out of the fire and poke their wife in the thigh or something if they're angry at them. There's no repercussions. That's just like she's just property. And so life kind of sucks for them. And when you get someone coming in and say, God loves you, God died for you, and there's a heaven and all this, and they're afraid with the animism, they're afraid of the spirits of the trees. Like, those aren't spirits. God is in control and he loves you. He's on your side. They're gonna eat it up. And especially when you're bringing in tons of medical supplies and all kinds of money, just pouring money into these tribes. They
like, wow,
sure,
God
I'll sign up
really
for Christ.
Some good stuff. I'll take God.
Yeah, I'll take God anyway. And so
I know that's how our missions was too. We'd travel to these more remote places, and not quite what you did. That actually, I mean, minus the whole Bible thing, that sounds really cool. But yeah, we would do a lot of that too, where it was just kind of very like remote, very, very poverty place, type places, and where, places where they had never even seen like, white Americans before. Somebody with lighter colored hair, although it's not light anymore thanks to my daughter sucking it all out, but meaning like pregnancy.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, it very much was like that. It was like, you're coming there to help bring supplies that they need, help build things, do projects for them. And when before you came, all they had was this tiny little building with one little light bulb or something,
Yeah.
And their source of food was to kill a pig and put it in a gigantic pot over a fire. And so you're offering hope. Yeah, I mean, we very much preyed on that type of stuff. Nothing intentionally malicious, but those are the people that very easily hold on to or take onto this hope that you're bringing them.
Yeah, especially in light of like the cargo cults, if you're familiar with them, where they literally believe that white people have the secret of the gods, and that's why they have all these cool planes and cars. And they're like, yeah, of course, send us a missionary. We want what you have. And so we'd hear these stories of tribal people begging the missions group, please send us missionaries. It's like it's bigger than they just want to hear from God. There's more to this story. They want our stuff, and not to say people shouldn't be getting stuff. They should be getting help if they really want it, for sure. But to say that when it's at the wonderful price of we'll give you our stuff if you'll place your faith in mythology, wow, that's some nasty stuff. That's some, and
It really is.
I will admit, though, I did it in a sense on a lower level with soup kitchens. I used to preach a lot in soup kitchens. There's a really poor community outside of Philadelphia called Chester, Pennsylvania, and I did a lot of work there. And we would, these people would come in for their dinner, and you got to sit through a sermon, which is always about the gospel, of course. But I used to preach to these people, and I knew that they would not be able to get to their dinner unless they had to sit and listen to me or some other pastor preaching. And it's all the same flavor. It's manipulation. It's abusive to people. And I'm so glad I got out. I'm so glad I'm hopefully making some reparations for it. But I know I've kept you here for a while. I appreciate your going through your story. Was there anything else I didn't ask you about that you wanted to mention before we wrap up?
I don't think so. Not that I can think of right now.
Cool. Well, I just wanted to say thank you for what you're doing. And again, everybody, we've been speaking today with Ashley Flieger, again on YouTube as Apostate Ashley. I'll have the links beneath the video, so you can just click on there, go like and subscribe, and check out her content. She's doing great work on her channels as well as with the Clergy Project. So please check her out, and thank you. Your platform is awesome. I want to see your platform explode, and I think you're doing some great stuff. So kudos to you, and thank you for sharing your story. I know there's a lot of painful things to share, so thank you for your vulnerability. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for listening.
Yeah, let's do it again sometime.
Yeah, for sure.
Cool. Thank you, Ashley.